Chapter 7 really centers around the critical period between the end of the American Revolution and what we consider founding of the nation as we know it today under the Constitution. Immediately following the Revolution, the government that had gotten us through the Revolution had negotiated an end to the war. That government operated under the Articles of Confederation. There were hardly any powers, however, granted to the national government. They could declare war if necessary. They could manage foreign affairs, usually trade agreements with other countries. They could make treaties with other governments. But no law could pass domestically without the unanimous approval of the states. Meaning a 2/3 majority vote. And that is practically impossible. I mean, even under our modern Constitution, a 2/3 majority vote is what is required to pass an amendment to the Constitution, which we know is relatively rare. So, through this 7-year period between the end of the war and the Constitutional Convention, many proposals are made to strengthen the national government, but nothing could receive unanimous support from the states. So the Articles of Confederation are rather dysfunctional, and we'll come back to this. One of the few successes of the Articles of Confederation are the Western Land Ordinances, particularly the Northwest Ordinance is most well known. This is one of the few successes of the Articles. How would states eventually enter the Union? What population thresholds would they need to reach? How would their states be divided up into counties, etc.? So, organization of land. Now, the biggest weakness of the Articles of Confederation is that there's absolutely no power to tax. Instead, the federal government depended on funding voluntarily given by the states, which obviously nobody's just going to be like, ooh, we're eager to give lots of money to the federal government. So no tax revenues means you can't pay off your debts, you can't pay the veterans of the Revolution, and even existing military officials can't be paid. So you can't even maintain military to protect yourself and to maintain national security. So one of the first issues to come to a head was the inability to pay veterans of the Revolutionary War. And these veterans weren't getting their payments, and they were losing their homes, losing their farms, which leads to, will bring me to Shays' Rebellion. So debtor farmers in Massachusetts are losing their farms, and Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, led a rebellion that shut down the state's court system so that no more foreclosures could even take place, and the rebellion had to be put down by an army raised by the governor. Again, the army, like national army, wasn't able to be utilized because there was no power to tax and maintain such a military. So this is very, very shocking how a ragtag group of veterans could nearly overthrow a state government. And so all of a sudden, some of the, hey man, our system needs fixing, leads people to even go as far as to say, we need an entirely different government. This is really dangerous. So then you have the Philadelphia Convention convened in the summer of 1787, all as a result of Daniel Shays, and this is a painting depiction of Daniel Shays. So, some contrasting views of Shays' Rebellion. James Madison, here on the bottom, liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as the abuses of power. What he means by this is really that unchecked public liberty might actually threaten private liberties like property ownership by overthrowing the government and causing a lot of chaos. On the flip side, though, Thomas Jefferson here up top said, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So he thought the government should have a healthy fear of its citizens. So these are contrasting views. People like Jefferson liked the Articles because it provided all the power to the individual states. Madison was more apt to support a replacement that gave more power to the national government. So the most vocal nationalist is Alexander Hamilton. Now, he believes in a strong national government that would promote American power, particularly economic growth, and we will come back to this later in the course. He comes up with a banking system plan for the United States. A much more pragmatic nationalist is James Madison. Madison, as we see before, feared that unchecked personal liberty might lead to anarchy, and that would actually lose people liberty in the long run. So he's a little more pragmatic and wants to hash things out as a group at the Philadelphia Convention, whereas Alexander Hamilton is much more of a spirited proponent of replacing the Articles. So Thomas Jefferson is on a diplomatic mission to France, and John Adams is on a diplomatic mission to Britain, and are not even present at the Philadelphia Convention. Now, nearly all of those who did attend were upper-class, wealthy people. More than half of the attendees have a college education, and to put this in perspective, less than 1% of the U.S. population in 1787 had college degrees. So this is an elite group of people. The hearings are held in secret, so the debates wouldn't be put out to the public and have all the scrutiny coming in until they had a final document for people to scrutinize and comb over. And the only modern record of the Philadelphia Convention, the only reason we even know much about it, is from the very careful notes taken by James at Madison during the convention, and they were sorted through and published for public viewing after his death in 1836. Here is a famous painting depicting the Philadelphia Convention and the debates being had. Now, the structure of our government was one of the first debates had at the Philadelphia Convention. The first proposals are actually quite extreme and were never even seriously considered. Alexander Hamilton proposed an executive and a Senate that served for life, similar to the British House of Lords. He was very aristocratic, and he thought only upper-class people should serve in government. He thought that, quote, the rich and well-born needed to rule because lower classes, quote, seldom judge or determine right. His proposals received no support at all, though. Very few people aligned their beliefs with Alexander Hamilton. Most attendees thought that there could be a happy medium between his thoughts and pure democracy thoughts amongst other members of the convention, which were also being disregarded. These moderate thoughts are proposed, and heated debates are had over them, and then they finally hash out a government that we know today. One of the first more middle-of-the-road plans that was proposed was the Virginia Plan. Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph proposed this plan towards the beginning of the convention, and the proposal included a three-branch system, which we're very familiar with. A bicameral two-house legislature. Again, we're very familiar with this. This is what our government looks like today. One house would be directly elected. The second would be chosen by the various states' state legislatures. Representation within both these houses of the legislature, however, would be based on population. This is called proportional representation. This is the biggest sticking point to the Virginia Plan. The proposal is extremely unpopular among the smaller states who claim that Virginia is trying to hijack power over the federal government almost exclusively for itself. This is depicted here by Virginia, which had a much larger population than smaller states like New Jersey, and actually New Jersey countered with a plan of their own. They thought that the Articles of Confederation should be amended. They should be fixed, but not entirely scrapped. The three-branch system should include a unicameral legislature with one vote per state, which is exactly what the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation was, including the authority to regulate interstate commerce, which was a huge issue in this time. States were having trade wars with each other. They had their own currencies, and this was an additional power that was going to be given to the national government under what they viewed as a slightly altered Articles of Confederation. Congress would have the authority to collect taxes from states based on the number of free inhabitants and 3/5 of the slaves in that state. This is part of the language where the 3/5 compromise later comes from. Congress would elect the executive, consisting of multiple people. That's actually referred to as a consul, where there's numerous people who reach a consensus on decisions in the executive branch, and they can't be reelected. They only serve one term, and can be recalled by Congress at any time a majority vote dictates it to be necessary. So very similar to our impeachment proceedings that are included in the Constitution. And then lastly, there would be a Supreme Court appointed by the federal executive, very similar sounding to what we have in today's Constitution, that would have authority in federal impeachment cases, and is the highest level of appeals, all of which is included in Article 3 that outlines the powers of the court system. So the biggest differences here are number 2 here, that it would be a unicameral legislature with one vote per state, as opposed to the bicameral legislature centered around proportional representation, as the Virginia plan had suggested. So they were very much in favor of this equal representation plan. Now, the division of power, these two terms are often used interchangeably, and they really shouldn't be. The separation of powers is the easy part. It's saying, hey, we should have branches of government with separate powers. Okay, yeah, they all could agree upon that. The harder part is checks and balances. Who gets what power and why? What's going to prevent one branch from dominating the other branches? And much of the debating at the Constitutional Convention is over this concept of checks and balances. This is very different than separation of powers. You cannot use these terms interchangeably, as people often do. The issue of slavery was very divisive. James Madison himself was a slave owner, but he knew that the system of slavery was inherently wrong, much like Thomas Jefferson had wanted to include a clause criticizing slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but he was prevented from doing so. Southern states said, we will never agree to the Declaration if you include that clause. The ideas of Madison were that because slavery was inherently wrong, that the distinction of color had become the basis for the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. So Madison himself is a slave owner. Jefferson was also a slave owner when he wanted to criticize slavery in the Declaration. But the idea that Southerners would not agree to any final form of government, there is no mention of slavery or slave in the Constitution as a result. And it would absolutely tarnish the validity of the Constitution for a good long period of time. And only through amendments after the fighting of the Civil War did we ever alter not only slavery, but outlining how former slaves would become citizens and have rights as citizens. South Carolina really is the linchpin that is holding the convention hostage. They demanded a fugitive slave clause to protect slave property. They wanted the 3/5 compromise to maximize representation in the House of Representatives, which we eventually see the bicameral legislature choosing one of each in the legislature, one House proportional, one equal. They want limits on taxation because they don't want taxes on slave property to become an issue. They demanded that the international slave trade not be outlawed right away. And it really would hurt South Carolina in particular if the slave trade had been abolished. States like Virginia, who'd had a slave trade for quite some time, they have an internal slave trade, and they're not really worried about the international slave trade, whereas South Carolina is still dependent on the importation of slaves. They don't have much of an internal slave trade the way Virginia had. Gouverneur Morris, a Pennsylvania delegate, said that he was being forced to decide between offending southern slaveholding states like South Carolina or doing injustice to human nature. And he said that for the sake of national unity alone, he would choose the latter. And many of the delegates felt horrible about some of the agreements that they were reaching over slavery, but they knew that the entire nation would fail if they did not. After the final document of the Constitution is written, there's a series of what we would think of as newspaper editorials written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Total of 85 essays are under the pen name Publius. All of them used the same pen name. Hamilton wrote 50 of them, Madison wrote 30 of them, and Jay only wrote 5 because he actually got sick shortly after the convention and was unable to produce very much of this pro-Constitution editorial material. Two of the most famous and heavily studied of the essays are Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Both of these are written by James Madison. In these two essays, Madison is speaking of factions and how people thought, oh man, there's going to be these factions, which really today we call them interest groups. Groups that favor certain opinions, certain political stances. And people were afraid that factions would gain control of the government and it would be abusive. Well, the factions, Madison actually said, would be competing for influence, and that no one faction would ever dominate because of the competition amongst the factions. So Madison is like, I understand your fears about factions, but believe it or not, I think that it's going to be a good thing to have lots of factions because no one faction will ever gain too much influence because of the amount of competition that will be had for influence in the government. Expanding the sphere is what Madison referred to allowing so many factions would in fact secure liberty and not threaten it. Today we know of the Federalist Papers as some of the most famous political editorials ever written. They are studied on the regular. I studied many of them in college, and very, very well known. Lesser known are some Anti-Federalist papers that are written. Excuse me. There are people who are writing under the pen names of Cato and Brutus, some of whom we never are able to identify in the same way that we can identify Hamilton and Madison and Jay. The Anti-Federalists think that the Constitution is giving way too much power to the federal government. And in contrast to Madison's view on factions, that all that competition would in fact protect liberty, the Anti-Federalists thought that a very extensive territory cannot be governed on the principles of freedom. That each of the individual states were better protectors of freedom and liberty than a large federal government. One of the biggest fears is that the wealthy would dominate the common person. And most of all, above and beyond anything else, it is civil liberties. I'm going to underline, star, circle. The fear of a loss of civil liberties is one of the biggest issues that the Anti-Federalists did have with the Constitution. Because the Anti-Federalists had such a huge concern about civil liberties and the rights of the citizenry, the Federalists convinced them to still support the ratification of the Constitution by offering a Bill of Rights. So this is really the Federalists gaining more support for the Constitution ahead of putting it out to the people for a ratification vote by adding this, or promising to add the Bill of Rights. And this would be done 2 years after the first government took office in 1789, because the final form of the Bill of Rights was adopted in 1791. So 92 newspapers existed throughout the United States, and most of these papers are owned by pro-Constitution Federalists, and only 12 newspapers nationwide published any kind of anti-Federalist essays. So it's much easier for the Federalist papers to get out to the people, and there was a relatively easy time achieving the 9 out of 13 states' approval of the Constitution. So in 1788, when it was ratified, the following November, there was the first ever federal election cycle. And in 1789, all of the first elected federal officials officially took office for the first time. Now, what is the effect of the writing of the Constitution on Native Americans? Well, if you remember, Joseph Brant had been fiercely loyal to the British because they had promised Native American autonomy and to prevent land-hungry white settlers from further encroaching on native lands. After Little Turtle, the leader of the Miami Confederacy, which is in Ohio, attacked U.S. troops, killing 630, there's an overwhelming response. And if you remember, this is also very similar to the Sullivan Campaign. There had been numerous war party attacks by Joseph Brant and his followers that got misconstrued as a common problem amongst like the entire Iroquois Confederacy, and that's not true. But same thing here. The United States government responds with overwhelming force, and 3,000 U.S. troops crush Little Turtle and his followers at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the resulting Treaty of Greenville led to native lands being ceded to the U.S. government, and that is most of what is today the state of Ohio. And really, again, tying Joseph Brant back into this, his worst fears of land encroachment were coming true in the Ohio River Valley. Native lands are being encroached upon more and more and more. You see here a drawing of Little Turtle, but also the map showing Indian cessions to the United States government as part of the Treaty of Greenville. Fort Greenville is located here. This is where the treaty was signed, but all of this territory in purple, including things that were disconnected to it, other locations along the Ohio River, and also what is today the city of Detroit, were included in the Treaty of Greenville. And this was after the Battle of Fallen Timbers here. So things are not good for Native Americans as a result of the signing of the Constitution, because it only leads to further encroachment on native lands. Blacks in the early republic were not as completely out of luck when it came to rights as you might think. Being a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson was one of the few early republic figures that believed non-whites were unequal to whites, not because of the race issue, but due to their economic conditions, their conditions as slaves, and that anybody could be a slave and be in the same boat, much like indentured servants in the colonial period. Native Americans, he thought, simply needed to assimilate and become farmers, and they were more than capable of being the equal to whites if they did that. On the flip side, he isn't understanding, obviously, the lifestyle of Native Americans is not that of just being a agrarian society. He's quoted about blacks as saying, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that blacks are to be free." But even in this time period, right up through the pre-Civil War time period, people like Jefferson, and yes, also men like Abraham Lincoln later in history, believed that once free, blacks should be recolonized back to Africa because they wouldn't ever find pure equality as citizens here in the United States. So you're kind of getting mixed messages here from Thomas Jefferson. He thought that there were ways of finding equality, and that your inferior conditions were based more around your economic status than it was your race, but then at the same time also supporting things like recolonization to Africa. So as obviously backward as some of Jefferson's ideas seem to us in the modern day, many of his thoughts, believe it or not, were quite forward-thinking for the time. This concludes the Phoner 7 lecture, the Chapter 7 lecture. And if you have any questions, by all means, please reach out to me, and I will see you in class.